Well, this issue is one of those very explosive issues that has the potential to be a stumbling block. Why do I say that? In Israel, the issue has been articulated as one of, if we allow the Palestinian refugees to return, this means the end of Israel as a Jewish state. If we allow a few million refugees to return, they will outnumber Israeli Jews, and so the state of Israel will no longer cease to exist. So Israelis look at it as another way of destroying the state of Israel. On the Palestinian side, they look at it as a right that is enshrined by international law. International law clearly says that refugees have the right to return to their homes and property if they choose to do so. So I think we need to adopt a more creative approach here. Instead of each side insisting, one side insisting no and one side insisting yes, I think we need to come up with some sort of creative solution where refugees are given a number of choices. Such as one would be citizenship in the country that they currently reside in. So if they're in a Syrian refugee camp, they become Syrian citizens. If they're in a Lebanese refugee camp, they become Lebanese citizens. That's option number one. Option number two would be some sort of monetary compensation. Option number three would be citizenship in a third country, like they could immigrate to the United States or Canada or Australia and so on and so forth. Option number four would be a return to a future state of Palestine. So instead of returning to, say, their homes in Akka or Haifa, they would now return to the new Palestinian state, which would have been established in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And option number five, one out of the five options, would be return to their old homes in what is now Israel. Now, option number five has a little catch to it. The number of the people allowed to return would be an issue that was to be negotiated between the parties. In other words, the number allowed isn't something that the Palestinians could impose on Israel, nor could Israel impose on the Palestinians. It would be a number that would be mutually agreed on by both parties. There's a famous Palestinian historian called Walid al-Khalidi, who I think came up with a very interesting sentence about how to solve this. He said, a number that would not be a threat to the Israelis nor an insult to the Palestinians.
Yeah, clearly that number, I don't know how it will be worked out, but I hope it will be. But let me go back to option number one, which you mentioned, and I personally think, like, in Lebanon, for example, I think the Palestinian refugees represent between 18 to 22% of the Lebanese population in Lebanon. So it would be extremely difficult for Lebanon, which is a small country to start with, to give citizenship to 18 or 22% more and become Lebanese. So it may work in Syria because there are not too many Palestinian refugees in Syria. It may work partially in Jordan because a lot of Palestinians already have dual citizenship, Jordanian and Palestinian citizenship. It may work in Iraq and Egypt and other places. But when I look at the Lebanese situation, it is kind of difficult for the Lebanese to accept the Palestinians as permanent citizens in their country.
Well, there's two issues here. Number one, there are actually surveys that have been taken of Palestinian refugees, and they've been given these five options. So we do already have a sense which options they choose. And secondly, I think it's important to remember that the refugee camps in Lebanon, the refugees living in these camps live in the worst conditions out of all the Palestinian refugees worldwide. So I think most of these refugees would not choose to stay in Lebanon, even if they had the chance to remain in Lebanon, given their current conditions. But let me go back to the results of the survey I talked about. The survey showed that the vast majority of Palestinian refugees, when given one of these five options, would choose to return as citizens of a new Palestinian state, because this would give them the feeling that they actually returned home and were able to contribute to the building of this new state as full and free citizens. Interestingly, only 10% of those refugees surveyed chose to exercise the option of returning to what is now Israel. And once they were told that if they exercised that option, they would have to acquire Israeli citizenship, that number dropped to 1%. So you get a sense from the survey that I think most refugees, and this again depends on their living conditions. I'm a descendant of Palestinian refugees. My father and my grandfather left in 1948 and were not allowed to return to their homes. Now, I live in the United States as an American citizen. I probably would not choose option of returning to live in Israel. I probably wouldn't choose the option of remaining in my host country because I'm not a refugee anymore. I would most likely choose compensation. So depending on your condition and depending on where you are in the world, your choices would vary. But I think most Palestinians who live in refugee camps in the Middle East would probably opt to return to what would be a new Palestinian state.
But again, you think there is enough room in the West Bank and Gaza? Gaza is already overpopulated, something like 100 times more than any other piece of land on the face of the earth. And the West Bank itself is really not that big. If you look at the West Bank and Gaza, both of these pre-1967 borders, both of the West Bank and Gaza comprise 22% of historic Palestine. And I live on the West Bank. I lived on the West Bank. I live in the States now, but we still have a house on the West Bank. And I don't really see enough space on the West Bank to have 2 more million or 3 million additional people living on the West Bank.
Well, I don't think the number would be that high, 2-3 million. I mean, I think the total number of Palestinian refugees worldwide, according to UN, and the figures obviously vary here for political reasons. Some people try and make them seem more than they are. Some people try to make them seem less than they are. But they're in the 3 to 4 million range. And so if I'm pretty confident that a new Palestinian state that was being assisted financially by the world community, where there was job creation, where there was employment, where there was, I mean, think of the massive amount of construction alone that's going to be required to build a new Palestinian state. I think it could easily accommodate upwards of 1 million people. And I think now in terms of how many, what's the number of the people that Israel might take in, I think that, if I was to guess very roughly, I think the number of that might be negotiated between the two parties would fall somewhere between the 200 to 250,000 range. And then, you know, a lot of the rest might choose to remain in their host countries. For example, the Palestinians who live in Jordan, in the refugee camps, the refugee camps there resemble more cities than they do actual camps. They're much more, they have many more rights than refugees do in Syria or Lebanon, for example. So a majority of those have already established themselves there, have jobs, might choose to remain in Jordan. So like I said, depending on the conditions they live in are the ones that might want to return. And since that number isn't very high out of the total number, I think it's something that could work. I mean, if we take the 2 countries that have the largest amount of Palestinian refugees, Lebanon and Syria. If we added those 2 numbers together, if we took the highest possible number that the numbers in Lebanon, again, they vary. Some people say 250,000, some people say 400,000. So let's take a middle figure of 300,000. And let's lump in another 300,000 from Syria. And let's say each single one of these refugees wanted to leave. That's still only 600,000. And if 150,000 went to Israel, that leaves 450,000 for Palestine. I think a new Palestinian state could easily absorb 400,000 refugees.
So basically, you don't look at this as really the most intractable problem. I always thought of it as really the most intractable problem is the right of return myself. But you don't look at that as a major problem.
No, I think it is a serious problem that has the potential to be very intractable if both sides insist on maximal positions. But if both sides approach this issue in a sense of compromise and in a sense of trying to find a solution that satisfied both sides' needs, allows both to retain their character, one as an Israeli Jewish state, one as a Palestinian Arab state, and also gives the refugees a sense of final justice